Before we begin, I name-dropped them at the end of the video, but I wanted to start this off by thanking the people behind the Human Exception podcast and the r/Jennifer Cornett FF House subreddit for allowing me to use them as a resource. This video would be lacking so many details without them. With that out of the way, let's begin. Hey y'all, David here. Welcome back. As you may be able to guess from how empty this bookshelf behind me is, besides the Legos and the Gur plushie I crocheted, I am in the process of moving. I have lived in Oregon for 3 years now, and I am heading to the UK for grad school. I've no clue what kind of people I'll be living with in the dormitory over there, and I have to confess, I'm a little worried. Roommates of any sort can be difficult. I've had a few come and go in the last few years I've lived in this apartment, and some have been easier to live with than others. But I always tell myself, whenever we get into like a spat or a disagreement, that things could always be worse. Living with others always creates difficulties, after all, and I've certainly heard my fair share of stories about irresponsible, lazy, or just plain gross roommates from friends and from people on the internet. And of course, as today's topic demonstrates, sometimes a roommate isn't just a thoughtless or irresponsible or argumentative person. Sometimes they are a manipulative abuser out to exploit you for their own gain. Today we are speaking about the Final Fantasy House, an infamous story about a micro-cult which spawned legendary status online after one of its victims posted his story and experiences to LiveJournal way back in the early 2000s. This is a story about how one woman did whatever she could to keep others under her thumb, all in order to exploit them, and how she used seemingly an innocuous and nerdy thing like fandom to do it. This is a story about how one of the most popular video games of all time became the basis for a fucked up doctrine that led to brainwashing, starvation, financial coercion and control, and lasting trauma to the people who suffered underneath it. This is not the first time I have spoken about this kind of fandom cult on here. 2 others have been discussed on the channel before. But as far as I am aware, the Final Fantasy House is chronologically the oldest example of this sort of thing happening, albeit not by much. I think Andy Blake was just getting started around the time that the early parts of this story had already come underway. Before we begin, though, I want to make it clear, in telling this story, I want to be respectful to the victims, to what they went through, and to their personal lives. And yes, regardless of how bizarre the beliefs they were indoctrinated into were, they are victims. And I want to try and be mindful of that. This is an odd story for sure, but that doesn't mean that the people inside of it don't deserve some respect from us. And it's also one that, despite its strangeness, we as outsiders can learn from. The Final Fantasy House was one of the earliest examples of how internet fandom and the obsession people could have with media could become toxic and dangerous. And as such, it remains a cautionary tale to anyone who is quote-unquote extremely online or involved in a fandom of any sort. And so, without further ado, let's get started. At the center of all of this is a single individual, Jennifer Cornett. Jennifer Cornett, or Jen as she's usually called, is the founder of what the internet eventually came to call the Final Fantasy House. It was her actions and choices which caused all of this to happen. If this was a fictional story and like a horror movie, she'd be the villain. She'd be like, I don't know, like Aunt Gladys from Weapons, the one responsible for everything. You know, considering the fact that that villain kidnaps people and then brainwashes them and keeps them in her house and does all this in the name of her own gain, that's kind of an apt comparison, actually. Is talking about weapons gonna date this video? I don't know. Let's keep going. Jennifer Cornett's early life was not an easy one. She was born into a family, seemingly a decently well-off or upper-middle-class one, and her parents ended up going through a very messy divorce. She was diagnosed as a child with oppositional defiance disorder, and it's been suggested in some interviews with her victims that her father was verbally abusive to her mother, although I think we mainly have Jen's word for that, and we're gonna see later down the line that that's not necessarily something that can be trusted. Not long after the divorce, when Jen was a teen, her parents sent her to a boarding school after getting sick of what they felt was her very disruptive behavior. This boarding school wasn't just any school, though. It was run by the WWASP, the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs and Schools, and let me just tell you guys, this organization fucking sucks. To this day, it remains a huge pillar of the troubled teen industry, and like many organizations within that industry, there are countless stories of abuse from survivors who attended their schools. The troubled teen industry in North America is a really fucked up institution, one where, depending on where a teen or child is sent, they can be subjected to a variety of abuses in the name of helping them. These can range from enforced labor, beatings, depriving them of food or sleep, even forcibly kidnapping people from their homes without being given a heads up. It's really bad and really fucked up. I could be here for hours describing every twisted thing the troubled teen industry has done to kids who often really needed help, which they ended up not receiving. But that is not the point of the video, which is a relief for me because this subject's already messed up as it is, and I don't want it to make it even darker. As such, I will keep my discussion of her time at this place relatively short. The school Jen was sent to was called Cross Creek in Utah, where, according to survivors, victims of it were subjected to conversion therapy, sexual abuse, and what these victims themselves call psychological torture. It's here at Cross Creek, though, that Jen met another teenager who'd been sent there named Mila, or Mela. I don't know how to say it. Sue me. This friendship was seemingly genuine, at the time at the very least. To quote Mila herself, "We got along pretty good because Jen was known as that crazy girl who thinks she's a vampire, and I was that crazy girl who thinks she's a space alien." I don't know what kind of shit Jen went through while at Cross Creek. Perhaps it contributed to her choices after the creation of the house, but one can only speculate. We don't know. In any case, eventually she turned 18 and Cross Creek could no longer force her to stay, and so she moved back in with her mother. Sometime after that, she began to get involved in online fandom, specifically in the Final Fantasy VII fandom. Online, she ended up meeting with a boy named Nate, who she began dating. Jen introduced Nate to the concept of role-playing, and despite the fact that he was more interested in Final Fantasy VIII and she was more into Final Fantasy VII, they got along pretty good. However, he began to tire of Jen's obsession with role-playing as FF characters. This was something Nate wasn't too interested in before he met Jen, and he began to feel that her focus on it as a hobby was taking something of an odd turn. The relationship ended, and these suspicions culminated in them breaking up during a visit where he caught her speaking to someone else she first met online as well, telling the other person that they were the reincarnated version of a character from the game. And that idea was just a little too much for Nate, who said he wasn't interested in that kind of thing, and as such, Jen all of a sudden just lost interest in him, and started dating the other internet acquaintance, who she'd been speaking to on the phone at the time, instead. Yes, really. I think she may have actually started dating him before this point, and was just kind of slowly disconnecting with Nate and just didn't bother telling him. This is something that Jen is going to do again in this story later on. But in any case, now that Nate was out of the picture, she was able to fully focus on her new beau, Hojo. So this is the part of the script where I was going to stop my recap to try and explain a bit about the plot of Final Fantasy VII, but I took one look at the Wikipedia page and just kind of gave up. I ended up asking a friend who's really into JRPGs to explain a bit about the game, and all he had to say was that it was difficult to explain. Guys, I'm trying here. You're not making it easy. I ended up learning a bit about this, but I'm not going to get too in detail. I suppose the details of the game aren't too important. I did learn a little bit about it, and so I can discuss some parts of it that I think are relevant, but I'm not going to give you a full rundown. And with that said, we can now move on with the story. Although before I do, I should probably explain the beliefs that Jen started espousing at this time. As you just heard, she told Hojo that he was the reincarnated version of a character from a video game. Jen, it seems, had become a believer in something which was at the time called soul bonding. Essentially, it's the belief that you are the reincarnated version of a character from another universe, usually a character from some sort of fictional property that exists in ours. It was essentially fiction-kin before fiction-kin was even a thing, assuming you know what fiction-kin is. Basically, people who believe that they are the reincarnated versions of fictional characters. Okay, so this is an unusual set of beliefs to say the least, but it's honestly not surprising to me that people do have them. And yes, people still do. Most of them aren't delusional cult leaders like Jen as well. Human beings are not logical creatures at all. We try to be. We're the smartest animal on the planet, but that's just kind of damning us with faint praise more than anything else. We are a hell of a lot more emotional than we like to admit, and fandom can become all-encompassing. It can be what someone derives a lot of meaning and identity from. Stories, even fictional stories, can mean a lot to people, and as such they can be a lot more emotionally resonant than the stories one may read in the Bible. If you take that fact that people are already drawn to these stories and have strong attachments to them, with the fact that there are rather popular beliefs in alternative circles in things like alternate dimensions, astral projection, reincarnation, and so on, well, you just have to accept a few of those beliefs to eventually just lead you to the idea that someone could hypothetically be the reincarnated version of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes or something. Personally speaking, as an atheist, I think belief in anything, even in more traditional religions, requires faith. You have to choose to believe. And if you do choose to believe, your choice is probably not just going to be based on objective fact. It's going to be based on feeling, on some sort of spiritual connection that you think you're feeling. I personally believe that you can get a spiritual connection from all sorts of places. Some people get it from attending Mass at church, and some people get it from hiking and seeing a beautiful view. So even though I don't derive any kind of strong spiritual feeling from things like video games, I think it's feasibly possible that a human being could. As such, if someone were to really feel intensely about a video game, I mean, why not, I guess. Is it weird? Yes. But I'm unsurprised that it happened is all. And look, there are people out there who believe much more dangerous things than that are much more mainstream. So if people want to believe in this, like, who has the energy to care? Like, it's fine. It's weird, but it's fine. You know, guys? Just, that's my perspective in this video. If it pisses you off, that says more about you than it does about me. I bring this up because while the beliefs are unusual, how Jen weaponized them is what matters more than anything else. Getting back to Jen, we should probably talk about this new person she started dating at this point, Hojo. So, in other retellings, you may have heard this person be called Renee, but that is this person's dead name. Hojo is trans. Also, Hojo isn't his real name, it's just the character that he kinned from Final Fantasy VII, but I'm going to be using Hojo to refer to him regardless. Him being trans is relevant because I want to clear up misconceptions about this person and their identity. There's a lot of dead naming and misgendering and hateful rhetoric directed towards him online. And also because him being trans was something Jen kind of weaponized against him to keep him under her thumb. We'll get to what I mean by that in just a little while. Also, this may be a tad confusing, but I am going to be referring to him exclusively as male, using male pronouns. It is worth keeping in mind, though, that he hadn't fully reached the point of realizing and coming out as trans when Jen met him. He was still presenting and identifying as a woman. However, with that said, he had begun to explore and experiment a bit with his gender identity, and so he's in kind of a weird place at this point in his life where he meets Jen, is what I'm trying to say. It may be a little confusing, but just keep in mind that this guy eventually would come out as trans, but he probably hadn't even fully realized that he was when Jen first met him and when he first started interacting with her. Moving on, our story picks up where we left off with Hojo, the guy who Jen had started dating, and a friend he had IRL who knew him and was quite close to him at the time, who went by the name Marley. Whilst Hojo himself has never spoken about his experiences in the house, Marley was a witness to him getting involved in it, and thanks to his interview with the human exception, we can continue our story. Marley and Hojo met in college and bonded over a variety of nerdy interests, including roleplay. By the time the two were acquainted, Hojo was already interested in soul bonding, though his interest in it predates him meeting Jen and her getting into it, and Marley has speculated that perhaps his interest in this soul bonding thing was a way for him to experiment with his gender safely, being able to identify as a male character in the abstract, and feeling he was embodying that character, while still in some shape or form presenting as a woman to the rest of the world. As per an interview with Marley, and I am quoting him, "I don't know that he had a clear idea of being trans at that time, or if it was more that he felt comfortable expressing himself in a way that leaned more towards things defined as masculine. I've always been a tomboy myself, so at that time, that was one of the things that led to us connecting strongly. I get the whole feeling of your body not really being your home. I think for him, soul bonding was how he explored this. He could be a male-identified character, and that was comfortable for him." Jen and Hojo dated online for a while, and then one day, she came to visit. She traveled to the college town Hojo lived in via a bus ticket which he himself paid for, and she just kind of never left. She just stuck around and didn't really end her trip. It just became permanent. When she was first arriving, though, Marley was asked by Hojo to meet his long-distance girlfriend, and I'll let Marley themselves explain their impression of Jen, at least at this point. "My first impression was of this awkward girl with huge eyes like a deer in headlights. She looked so nervous. I figured moving cross-country was pretty stressful, so at first I tried to be nice to her, especially since she was my good friend's girlfriend. She introduced herself with her actual name, and we went to their new apartment. Jen seemed relatively normal to Marley at first, and she even shared some of her background with them, including mentioning her experiences at Cross Creek. All of this seemed to be genuine to Marley, but she began to lie randomly, changing details of her background or outright contradicting herself not long after that. So yeah, this is something I alluded to earlier, but it's not super relevant to the story, but it is worth mentioning that Jennifer Cornett was something of a compulsive liar, even well before this point, even as a teenager. According to a biography she herself allegedly once posted about herself, all of these things are supposedly true about her. I've been asked if I was Jennifer Lopez. No clue about that one, and I'm known at Disneyland as Indiana Jen, the girl who gives temple tours for free because tourists are always getting lost. I don't know why that's in quotation marks, but whatever. I can't go to Hollywood because I get chased by people who think I'm famous. Goddamn advice. Walk like you own the place. Given to me by a security guard who let me on the set of Anaconda, a particularly craptacular movie, or so I've heard. If you've seen it, you know that big waterfall? Yep, I was on top of that, and in that old riverboat. I think I'm particularly ugly and unlikable. I'm not sure why people like me, but some seem to. I have no father, and my mother isn't human. My crazy Uncle Michael works for MI5, and my best guy friend was created in a super secret laboratory in Glendale, California, and born in the same hospital I was in Pasadena, which leads us both to believe that I might be part of the same project. My husband, by the way, besides being Metatron, is also a no-life king. Not a Nosferatu, no, but an Ethnoros, and a mad scientist, and an emperor, and a priest. I shared that quote with a friend, and his response was, "As a literary critic, I have to say, the lore is overcomplicated." And you know what? He's right. The lies Jen was telling Marley and Hojo's other friends weren't this out there, seemingly, but she was still contradicting herself and completely obfuscating the truth about her background. At first, Marley says, her story was that her ex, of whom she had lots of pics she loved to show off, was controlling and abusive and she had to leave California to escape him. She had this one photo of him that she would pull out all the time at first when her strategy seemed to be making Hojo feel like he was supposed to compete with this guy, so Jen wouldn't just leave and go back west. Over time, probably after he kept refusing to give her money and she realized that demonizing people got her sympathy and stronger connections with others in her orbit, he became this demon who had abused her and was constantly attacking her with magic, etc. Okay, maybe the lies got out there pretty quickly during this trip as well. At this point, she was not accusing her family of anything and was in regular contact with them. I was present for many phone calls between her and her family, and everything seemed completely normal. Her stories about her family and her ex would evolve depending on things she heard from other people. If, for example, someone were to talk about having a parent or an ex who would hit them, a week later, Jen would be telling everyone the same thing about her parents or ex. It was like clockwork. And it would always be that, oh, she forgot about it because of the trauma and now she remembered. As someone who had an abusive parent, has been diagnosed with PTSD, and who actually has memory issues due to a traumatic brain injury, I really came to loathe her attention-seeking lies. Jen's behavior towards Hojo is also pretty damn reprehensible. Soon after she arrived for her visit, he started becoming a lot less social. Marley recalls him being a very outgoing person, but this soon started to change after Jen's arrival. Jen never enrolled in the nearby college, never seemed to want to head home back to California, and barely worked, and yet she still stuck around Hojo like glue for ages and ages. Also, despite the fact that she was dating someone who at the time was identifying as a woman, she claimed to not be a lesbian, which on its own would be fine. I mean, bisexual people exist, as do pansexual people and so on. But she claimed she wasn't attracted to women at all. Marley says, Jen would often tell Hojo that he could never satisfy her because Jen was not a lesbian, and Hojo could never truly please her because he didn't have, quote, the right equipment to do so. She would moon over that photo of her supposedly abusive ex because he could satisfy her in ways she told Jack he never could. Girl, just get a dildo. It's all really gross, but it worked how she wanted it to. Hojo seemed to think he was going to have to accept this male identity that was being pushed onto him. I'm obviously not saying he would never have arrived there on his own, but more that he was pushed into things much more quickly than the pace he was moving at before he met Jen. I think this was part of her tactics towards undermining his sense of self, forcing him to be what she wanted, making him feel insecure about the relationship. He wasn't ready to publicly be the person Jen wanted him to be, so he became more and more isolated. Okay, so I have no clue what kind of conversations about gender identity, if any, Jen had with Hojo at this time. But to me, however, this reads like Jen was at least somewhat aware that he was maybe experiencing gender dysphoria and was playing on that deliberately to make him more insecure. Whether that was her intention or not, that seems to have been the result, and I don't know, I suspect that even if she didn't know that he was trans, she could tell that this was something he was insecure about. Also, despite supposedly finding the body Hojo had at the time disgusting, Jen would sometimes openly grope him in public, while others were watching. All of this despite the fact that Hojo was not very comfortable with displaying that sort of affection in public, I might add. When frat boys would walk by, Jen would immediately start groping Jack and shoving her hands down his shirt. She's all about the attention, and Jack didn't enjoy it at all. I may have called him Jack before, but that's another name that Hojo used, or that he uses now. That's his real name. I'm still going to mainly use Hojo, but if I accidentally say Jack, that's who I'm referring to. I didn't get it at the time, why he'd be with her when she did that kind of stuff to him, and TBH, I still don't actually get it, and honestly, me neither. Like, if someone was just forcibly groping me in public when I didn't like it, I mean, I would just get away from that person, but I digress. Months passed, and then Hojo and Jen were suddenly getting married. At the time, it was illegal for two women to be married in the state of Pennsylvania where all this went down, and Hojo's legal gender hadn't changed, so this would have been an issue. They ended up having a more symbolic wedding ceremony, but, didn't actually file it with the state. Specifically, they had a hand fasting, which is a pagan form of wedding. It was a small ceremony, mostly with just Hojo's friends as guests, since nobody really knew Jen at the time. And before that, they even had a joint bachelorette party as well, at Hooters, of all places. Side note, I have to admit, I find something kind of funny about a quote-unquote lesbian bachelorette party happening at Hooters. I don't know, it tickles me for some reason. After the hand fasting, Hojo's behavior began to change further. He began missing work hours and didn't attend as many classes as he once had. Now that they were married, it seems, Jen had begun to use the fact that she was his wife as leverage so he'd do what she wanted, Marley describing it as such. Jen would refuse to let him leave the house. He got in trouble for absenteeism. He either quit or got fired. Eventually, I don't think he worked at all and was just home pretty much all the time. Regardless of anything else, Hojo was now fully under Jen's thumb, and his life suffered greatly due to it. And unfortunately for Marley, while they noticed the change in Hojo's behavior, they weren't aware of how bad things were getting. And he was soon leaving to study for a year abroad in Japan, so there wasn't much he could do about it either. Hojo was already completely isolated because his abuser had made him cut contact off from the rest of the world, and now one of his closest friends that he still had was leaving. He was in a really bad place. He was even more vulnerable to her abuse than he'd already been up to this point, to say the very least. And this is probably as good a time as any to talk about who Jennifer said she was soul bonded to from Final Fantasy VII. While Hojo believed he was bonded to the character of Professor Hojo from the game, hence the name I'm mainly using for him, Jennifer believed she was bonded to the character, if she really counts as one, of Genova. Genova is a weird alien creature who crash-landed on the planet the game set on, which millennia ago tried to kill the entire planet. In the present day of the game, her cells are used to give soldiers super strength and extra abilities, but if their minds aren't strong enough, she corrupts them, turning them into monsters, infecting them. There's a lot more to her than just that, but I find these facts about the character kind of bizarre. It really leads me to have more questions about Jen's psyche at the time. Assuming that her belief in this sort of thing was genuine, apparently the character she felt most connected to was an alien monster that consumes other people before moving on to another victim. And considering her own behavior, how Jen attracts people to her before draining them dry and tossing them aside, there's a weird and unfortunate dramatic irony to that. It just makes me wonder what was going on in her head. Why that character, and why did her own behavior, in some vague sense, kind of parallel some of the stuff that that character could do in the game? I don't know. And yes, it wasn't just Hojo who she went after. Jen's influence did not just extend to a single person, I'm afraid. Not at all. The Final Fantasy house was only just beginning to be formed at this point. So, this is where one of the most famous people to share their experiences with Jen stepped into the picture. Icarus. He's the one who put together a website which featured his own story as well as several others, which was the main source of information about the story for a long time, and I think it's time to hear a little bit more about him specifically. Icarus was an active member of the Final Fantasy fandom, and ran a fan page devoted to his favorite characters from the game, namely Cloud and Zack. And yes, amongst all the other characters in that game with names like Sephiroth or Genova or Aerith, there's also one named Zack. I don't get it either. Through his site, one day he was contacted by someone who offered to share a link to his own fan page, specifically a fan page focused on the character of Hojo. 3 guesses who this is, you win no prizes. This person introduced themselves to me as Hojo and pretty quickly started calling me Zack. I was okay with that because Zack was and still is my favorite character in the game. For a while it was mostly normal. This Hojo person seemed to be just another normal webmaster. We didn't have a whole ton in common, so we didn't talk that often. And then one day, Icarus posted to his fan site a piece of fan art with a short bit of fanfiction written underneath it, and Hojo messaged him. "It was really realistic," he said. "Is that a memory?" And understandably, I was like, what? Is that one of your memories? Hojo then asked Icarus to speak to his wife, to Jen, and she started sharing her beliefs with Icarus, proselytizing like she once did to her ex-boyfriend Nate. I was asked if I had any memories of past lives. I do believe in past lives. I think it's a pretty valid cycle given how many cultures believe in it. So I told her no, I didn't have any, but I did believe in them. I should never have said that. It was like inviting the vampire into my house. Jen's attack was swift and sure. She began in a flurry explaining things to me, how there are alternate universes. Do you grant me that? Sure, there could be. And in those universes, maybe, just maybe, video games actually happened. I thought it could be possible, because I like imagining anything's possible. Through all this flurry, she tells me that she thinks in a past life I was Zack from Final Fantasy VII. If you think about it, she said, you're both country grown, you both have that instinct of dragging out friends who could be left behind. How did she know that? They were just internet friends and not very close ones at this point. I don't know. You take a bullet for someone, right? It's a strange assumption to make about a person as well. You say you don't believe in magic or any of that, and he wanted to be a mercenary. For all of his 5 or 6 lines, you have a similar speech pattern. How did she know that? Okay, I need to stop asking questions. You even live in a basement like he was locked in one, and you hate it. Addle your brain with freshman idiocy and vodka, he continued, and this will suddenly make sense. Sure, maybe, but I'm not him now, I said. But I guess it was possible. Icarus was open to the idea, I guess, but he wasn't really attached to it either. He was just like, maybe it's true, whatever, I don't care, I've got the real world to deal with, you know? Despite this, he became internet friends with them, getting closer and closer, and then he was eventually invited to come out to visit the 2 of them. His description of this very first trip gives us some insight into the living conditions both Jen and Hojo were living in at this time, so I'm gonna be quoting a bit more from him. The first time they asked me to visit them, I think, was around Christmas. It would cost me $300 to go by bus from my podunk school to their apartment in State College, and they assured me that they would pay to feed me. I would just visit for a weekend to meet people and hang out. At the bus stop, Hojo met me in a lab coat. When we arrived at the apartment, Jen, who insisted I call her Genova and would often refer to herself as Jenny Nova, came storming up to Hojo and I, screaming in Hojo's face. I have no idea what it was about. She was wearing a purple skirt pulled up around her breasts. It looked like she had just got out of bed, and I was, to say the very least, intimidated. About 3 seconds later, though, she whirled around in a quick change, suddenly the nicest person ever. Whatever she was mad about was suddenly out the window. During this trip, we got brief hints of some of Jen's other behaviors as well. For example, Jen had a habit of beginning to channel other people and personalities in order for things to go her way. Icarus wrote about this. She believes that she has a lot of people living inside her head talking, and when she wants to take on a personality that best fits a situation for her personal gain, she acts one out. I.e., if she wanted to get sympathy, she would raise the pitch of her voice and pretend to be an innocent child. So some people have supposedly speculated that this means that she may have DID, dissociative identity disorder, but this is not a description of how that works. People with DID don't just suddenly shift personalities whenever it's convenient and most opportunistic for them to suddenly have something go their way. From what I've read, it can actually be deeply inconvenient. This was just her pretending to channel people so she could try and manipulate people whenever things didn't go her way. It was a way for her to try and play to sympathy, and that was it. Icarus also observed that how cluttered and messy the apartment the 2 of them were living in was, and began to realize just how seriously Jen took the whole soul bonding idea as well during this trip. At one point, she showed Icarus the quote-unquote magic battles that she sometimes undertook with Hojo, which were basically just the two of them LARPing and pretending to throw thunderbolts at each other and stuff. However, she didn't say that this was role-playing. She claimed that the magic actually was happening. She would swing around a stick or a sword to music and feign injury when Hojo threw stuff at her after making some goofy hand movements. Hojo would do the same when Jen would thrust her staff forward or something. They tried to get me to do it, but I can't act. I can't pretend I'm doing magic because I'm not that out of it. There's some kind of douchey comments sprinkled here and there in his very first account of this, but you know what? He was angry and confused, and they really fucked him up. So I kind of understand the tone, but I just thought I should at least acknowledge it. Eventually, Jen dragged me onto my feet. I kept laughing at both myself and the fact that I could do some sort of limp wrist movement, and Jen would throw herself on the floor panting. Afterwards, they kept telling me, "See, Zach, you can do magic." And I just kept laughing. I knew what I was doing. I was not that out of it, but I was ready to keep humoring them because it wasn't hurting anyone. Incidentally, I don't think this happened during his trip, but during one of these magic battles, Jen actually once got arrested and got mentioned in a local paper because of that. Despite all this strangeness, Icarus remained on good terms with them and visited a few more times after that. And then Jen began asking for money for food when he visited, despite the fact that it already cost him $300 for a ticket to come as it was. And they also kept trying to get him to remember being Zach. At one point, even locking him in a room in one of the school's basements to try and trigger his past memories. Despite all this, and I have to confess I don't understand why, but we all make stupid decisions in our 20s, I guess, Icarus ended up moving in with them over the summer. Through it all, I have to say, none of this was really that bad. Flaky, maybe annoying, but not that bad, so I was ready to hit the go button when Jen and Hojo suggested I live with them over the summer. I could get a job in state college and just hang out there. It'd be cool, a whole bunch of nerds, and I'd help make rent. I was all about this because nothing drives me nuttier than being trapped in Brooklyn for months on end. I'd had an ultimatum from my mother. A job in 3 days, or come home. Please realize how much hump I busted to find a job with no car and no phone number in 3 days. My dogs were dogged. Finally, I got one at a small supermarket. I asked the lady during the interview, because I was naive to pay, if it would be enough to pay a third of rent and food, because I was living with 2 other people and needed to pay. Jen's only job was a babysitter, which she did infrequently at best, when she felt like it, and Hojo was a college student. The woman said no problem. It was cool. I had my job. I was happy. And then things started to go bad. I can't even say what came first, chicken or egg. But let's just say that after 1 week, I was getting sick of it. I was the workhorse. I guess because I was Zach. I was therefore the manly man as opposed to Jen, the Cetra queen, or Hojo, the frail scientist. I find that description of Hojo very strange because I'm pretty sure he's a boss battle in the game, but whatever. Jen quit her babysitting job and refused to look for another one. I was the one who had to carry groceries to and from the house. The one who made the money to feed everyone. The one who had to fix or move furniture when it needed to be fixed or moved. My computer could rarely get online because Jen was on almost 24/7. The rest of the time she would watch me as I typed, so I could never make a journal entry that read something along the lines of, "Jen is abusing me, help me God, I'm tired and I want out of here." On top of all this, Jen would often take notes of the people Icarus did speak to online, often then going to message them herself afterwards to learn about them and more specifics about what he said. These surveillance tactics didn't just apply when Icarus was using his computer, though. She also was very resistant to him calling other people and didn't like him spending time with others outside the house. If he was to leave the house, Jen was to be told where he was going, and he also wasn't given his own key, having to rely on Jen to be let in and out of the apartment. She'd also sometimes wake Icarus up in the middle of the night, not allowing them to get a good night's sleep in order for them to go look at a magic mushroom that she found, or because spirits were attacking, or any other bullshit that she could come up with. And then, of course, was the constant fighting between Jen and Hojo. Icarus writes, "And then there was the fighting. Not the silly magic fighting I talked about earlier, but real fighting. Screaming fights, slapping, punching, the sound of flesh beating on flesh. It's not one you can miss. When I was 10, my parents went through a very rough divorce. I know these sounds, and they were bringing up really bad memories and bad feelings. And the apartment was small, so there was no way not to hear them. Hearing one of them wince or whimper, then the beating, and then immediately after the noisy sex. As you can imagine, since Icarus was the only person working, and thus the only person paying rent on a part-time job, financial troubles were constant. Despite that fact, though, Jen didn't seem to care, often insisting on them buying expensive steaks for dinner. Not just any steak, Icarus wrote. $10 steak. and Gatorade. 2 kinds, fancy and special colored, and spices. All of this would last us 1 night of food and my paycheck was gone. I couldn't even eat the food that was provided. The rest of the time they demanded I ask my job for day-olds from the bakery and day-old sushi. I swiped coupons from work and used them wherever I could. I could not afford lunch and there was no breakfast. If one of my supervisors caught me with the day-olds, I would be in trouble. The others seemed to take pity but didn't like that I was doing it. The day-olds I brought back, Jen complained she didn't like the flavor. This was the only food coming into the house. The lack of sleep, lack of food, the constant fighting between Hojo and Jen, the surveillance, all of it took a toll on Icarus's mental state. A big one. And the state of the apartment wasn't just messy by this point, it was horrid, as Jen seemed perfectly fine with living in squalor. The place was a pigsty. The reason was that Jen never cleaned. All the cleaning was done by guests. They frequently had people coming over for sleepovers and visits and things like that. I did the dishes frequently, but the trash was almost never taken out. It got to the point where the apartment smelled like rotting flesh. Jen refused to believe it was the trash and that it needed to go out. She kept claiming some former owner must have done something, but it was a horrible mess. Their only solution as they saw it was to move out, so they got a different apartment from the landlady. Jen also wore that purple skirt, the one she was first wearing when she met Icarus, all the time. And it was incredibly dirty too, as you can imagine. The state they were living in was also not helped by Jen's impulsive buying habits. She frequently enjoyed getting what she called shinies, little pointless trinkets, and she constantly wanted new ones. This desire for new things was seemingly an insatiable, impulsive part of her behavior. The shopping to fill the apartment was the worst, the new one that they moved to after they trashed the first one. I remember this night with nausea in my stomach. We went to Kmart, which was a long bus ride into town. I was already mildly upset because Hojo suddenly had money and yet we weren't eating with it, and I wasn't able to phone home. But I like house shopping, so I was sedated. We needed very basic things. A dish rack, some dishes, silverware, cups, a cooking pot, and some dish towels. We found all of these, but then Jen saw cabbage cloths. I don't even know what a cabbage cloth is. I assume it's a cloth you wrap a cabbage in to keep it fresh, and Jen wanted them for her cooking, so the cabbage wouldn't go bad. She never used cabbage in cooking. 1, and 2, that's what a crisper is for. But she wanted these outrageously priced plain thin white rags. Hojo said a towel would work, and then the fight erupted. Another screaming fight. According to one account as well, this intense desire for new and useless things would eventually, in the future from now, sometimes lead Hojo to sell his own blood. And you know what? Can I just say, I have compared Jen to 2 fictional monsters up to this point. To Genova and to Aunt Gladys from Weapons. And a part of me worries that by doing that, I'm somehow trivializing her actions and behavior. But I'm gonna do it again because when someone is literally having their partner sell blood so they can buy shiny things, I'm just gonna call them a vampire. That's what that is. That's what a vampire is. It's far too on the nose to not acknowledge it, I'm sorry. At this point, Icarus had become a shell of his former self. The physical toll of lack of food and sleep, alongside the mental toll of sharing such a disgusting space with an abusive person like Jen, really wore him down. In his own words, after a point, he was basically brainwashed. And yeah, I should mention that depriving people of food and sleep and all of that is classic cult stuff, classic brainwashing techniques. I don't know if she did this deliberately, but I have to wonder, you know? Eventually, one day, Icarus discovered that his shoes had been stolen, and this was the breaking point for him, for whatever reason. He just left. With help from friends, he was able to get food, and he moved in with his dad. He never forgot what he went through, though, which eventually led to him sharing his story with the world a number of years after the fact. Others crossed paths with Jen during Icarus's time with her. I want, before we move forward, to speak about one person in particular whose time and friendship with Jen overlapped with Icarus's a little bit. Around the time Icarus first started making visits to them, another was starting to have visits with them as well. Specifically another internet friend named Icarus. Icarus had befriended Hojo in 1999, and she also had an interest in soul bonding. I believe she's the one who introduced Hojo to the idea, as well as Jen. As per an interview she did a few years ago, though, her interest in it was a bit different from Jen's. We all, including Jen, knew on some level that the fandom stuff was just play. I hate to describe it as pretending, but it's the truth. It's just, if you pretend hard enough, you at least get to have the experience you're looking for, whether it's materially true or pure imagination. So why not? We had this sort of unspoken agreement not to break the illusion. We felt, I think, that if we all agreed to pretend intensely, it would be the next closest thing to experiencing fantasy adventures for ourselves. On some level, we knew we didn't want to throw magic fireballs. We wanted to feel as if we were throwing them, and unrealistically at that. We certainly wouldn't have been prepared for the consequences if any of it had worked. It was actually great fun, if intense. I regret none of that stuff. I just regret that Jen turned out to be so toxic. Eris didn't stay friends with Jen for very long. Soon after meeting her in person, Eris found something about her off-putting, as I'm sure you can imagine. This eventually led to a day where, after a very terse phone call with Jen, she decided to just completely cut ties. She wanted me to visit her that very weekend, and I said no for some reason that I don't even remember. It wasn't about her. But instead of just accepting that I wasn't going to be there on demand, she dug in her heels. Suddenly she was angry because she couldn't have her way, and she ramped up to saying that if I didn't visit her, our friendship was over. And I thought, this is what all of those cartoons and PSAs meant when they talk about people who aren't your real friends. Eris visited them one last time after this to pick up some things she left behind on a previous trip, and then left. She also wrote a letter to Jen, which was featured on Icarus's website. For some reason, I'm a little unclear on why. She calls herself Jen's apprentice, although I'm pretty sure that, she was the person who was first into soul bonding. So if anything, Jen should be the apprentice. And the letter, on the whole, is kind of written as if it's acknowledging Jen's beliefs a little bit. Not on the whole, but a little bit. Genova, when I became your apprentice, you told me to shut up and not argue with you. Apparently, a sorceress is supposed to be a creature who blindly accepts the opinions of the authorities, even when she firmly believes that they are wrong. From this, I learned that when Jen says something I disagree with, I need to nod and make agreeing sounds anyways. Otherwise, we would have to fight every 2 minutes, and quite frankly, saying what I thought was not worth that hassle. I am not, however, your apprentice anymore, and I am free to say what I think, and I will because it's a relief to say it, even if you aren't reading this. I do not actually give a crap whether you read it or not. It will hurt your feelings, and you will care that it happened, and I don't. You have been warned. This, be it right or wrong, is what I think. And then there's a list of bullet points, and I'm going to read about a half dozen of them, maybe a bit more, but not all of them because there's so many, you guys. You do not look like any FF characters. You look like Jennifer Cornett. End of story. I wish these people would stop calling Final Fantasy FF. I know that it's the acronym, it's the fastest way to say it, but it's also an acronym for Fantastic Four and also for fist f***. So my mind goes to other places is all I'm trying to say. I, for that matter, she continues, look nothing like Yuna. Yuna looks Asian. You have no money because you keep spending it on things you want. Anything you want is not automatically a magical item. There may be potential magic in everything, but then there's magic in things you don't bother to look at. Things you can have for free. If something is a magical item, that doesn't mean you must own it. It would be nice if you could, but you can't always do so. I had money because I rarely bought anything for myself. Whenever I got some money, I would save it. I am not a money generator, and neither are my parents. If you want to have money, you need to not spend it. I now do not have money because I spent it on you. Poof, all gone. And you still wanted more, but I didn't have any more to give you. Nobody has everything they want. Not you, not Hojo, not Zach, not Tickles, not Karina, not Britney Spears, not your parents, not Waka, not W, not even me. This is called life. It's a bitch. When a person, any person, gets something he wants, he immediately starts wanting something else. This is called being human. It too is a bitch. Soul bonds may be important. However, if you treat them like they are more important than what happens in the real world, then your real life will probably suffer. Your soul bond life, however, will be wonderful. If these results are unsatisfactory to you, then give your real life priority. You, not your soul bonds, are responsible for what you do. And it just kind of goes on from there. Eris, on the whole, recalls Jen in that same interview like this. What she wanted was compliments and flattery and attention. She had no self-control and no respect for boundaries. But she didn't want people to get angry or hate her because her motive was for everyone to love her and fawn over her. So she would stop just short of anything you could get angry about. As long as she thought she had you hooked, she didn't care whether you nudged her in a different direction to get her to drop whatever she was doing. She was opportunistic. All you had to do was flatter her a little and she'd be on board with your distraction. She would have been so easy to control right back. She was a tyrant, but also totally vulnerable if anyone wanted to take advantage of her. Incidentally, some people watching may have heard of kind of a sister story to the Final Fantasy house called the Sarah Saga. The Sarah Saga is a story shared on a Roommates from Hell forum where someone talked about a roommate they had who supposedly had similar beliefs to Jen, albeit about a different video game. This story was eventually linked to Icarus by people on the Something Awful forum, although there wasn't really any proof of it besides one guy's word. People just kind of assumed that she was the woman in the story, and that she and Jen were these two deluded ladies who had a falling out, and as such, another internet legend was born. But apparently that's not true. There are inconsistencies between Eris's life and the Sarah Saga, which make this basically impossible. If you're wondering how she got linked to the story despite that, well, when the Sarah Saga was discussed on the Something Awful forums, someone seemingly erroneously claimed that the person who was the subject of the story sounded just like their ex-girlfriend, who they were somehow able to recognize from the story. This person said that it was definitely the same person, and it just so happened that this person in reality did date Eris. There were apparently some similarities between herself and the woman Sarah in the story, but they were not one and the same. Eris suspects that the whole thing came about because some people wanted to smear her reputation deliberately and came up with the story as a way to do it. She apparently had made some enemies in the fandom for the video game that the Sarah Saga was based around, that this Sarah woman apparently worshipped. And she suspects that that is why this happened. There were enough similarities for people to eventually connect her to this so-called Sarah, but it wasn't her. If you're wondering about the inconsistencies I mentioned, whilst like the Sarah in the story, Eris did move from the East Coast to the West Coast, the timing of the moves don't match up. When the Sarah Saga was first starting to be uploaded, she had only just moved to the West Coast a few weeks prior and lived alone, not with roommates like Sarah did. She also had a partner. I believe that Sarah in that story was single, and other details are just kind of cherry-picked or slightly altered or exaggerated or just flat out fabricated. Seeing as I am discussing a topic others have in the past, I bring this up so I clear up any misunderstanding which other people may have in the past helped perpetuate. I'm not saying that they did it with deliberate malice. I think Eris only in the last few years has come forward to share her side of the story, but I figure, I'm talking about something that others have talked about in the past. I may as well, try and clear the air a little bit. Mind you, not all of Eris's behavior during this period was the best. She supposedly made sock puppets to harass herself in hopes of then claiming that Jen was behind them. I know, this is the second time on this channel we've talked about a woman doing this, but she wasn't the person who was talked about in the Sarah Saga. Period. There's more to it. I'm kind of glossing over it and giving you a very simple version of events because it is so complicated and this video is going to be pretty long as it is. If you want more details, look at Eris's interview page on the Human Exception website. And now let's move on. Let's get back to Jen, who not long after Icarus left, moved on with Hojo to another fandom entirely. Specifically, they began running a fan site in the Hellsing fandom, and if you're wondering what Hellsing is, it's an anime/manga that is even less relevant to the story than Final Fantasy VII, so don't worry about it. The main thing about this, though, is that once in the fandom, Jen again connected with someone new. This time, someone who goes by the name of Angel. Angel's a bit of a nebulous figure in this. She only started speaking about her experiences with Jen long after she left her, and her references to her have always been vague whenever she's spoken about her online, and not to mention some of her behavior according to other people who lived with Jen around this time, her own behavior was pretty awful regardless of whatever she herself went through. She supposedly was married to someone but left him to eventually, you guessed it, move in with Jen. From what I can tell, Jen told Hojo she wanted to open up their marriage, that they should be polyamorous, and Hojo just seemingly went along with this. Jen wanted Angel to be a part of things, and started dating her once she moved in. Quickly, however, after that move, Jen began giving Angel more and more attention, and though this did not happen immediately, over time, Angel eventually became her primary partner, with Hojo getting shoved hard to the sidelines, completely ignored. In addition to this, I just want to point out that Jen claimed before to not be attracted to women, and that Hojo couldn't please her because he lacked the right equipment, but as far as I can tell, Angel is a cisgendered woman. In other words, All that talk about how Hojo wasn't enough of a man was just her putting him down, and definitely a lie to make him more insecure. What a bitch. Not long after Angel moved in, Jen reconnected with Mila, the girl she was friends with back at the reform school she'd been shipped off to as a teenager. Mila had recently had a huge fight with her parents, who'd sent her to that boarding school in the first place because she was a lesbian and they wanted to cure her. And she was looking for a new place to live. Jen, as a result, leapt at this and offered to let her stay with them. Mila agreed, and things immediately went bad. Shortly after I moved in, Angel's jealousy went from bad to horrible. She was constantly sulking around, giving me dirty looks, etc. Jen's solution to the jealousy is she was to set up a situation where it looked like she was cheating on Angel with me, so Angel would realize it's not that bad. Not only did she come up with this horrible idea without telling me, but she kissed me in public randomly when Angel was driving up in the car, making it look like I had made the moves on Jen, and Angel was really upset. Kissing a girl without consent is totally normal behavior for a supposedly straight woman to do, apparently. I think Angel would have gotten violent if it wasn't obvious that I was in as much shock as she was. This is a perfect example of how Jen starts drama. I moved in with $17,000 in my bank account, and soon Jen had drained all of that on necessities for the house, many of which went into her room and never came out. Soon, I received a check from the investment company for $80,000, and Jen's spending began again in earnest. I tried to get her to stop spending money on frivolous things, but every time I told her no, or that she should spend her own money buying things for herself, she threw a fit. All this time she was telling me how important I was to her special plan and how the world needed us to stick together so we could conquer evil, etc. I wanted desperately to feel special. I was scared and alone, and I believed her. She knew a few magic tricks, was very good at reading people, and could give relatively accurate tarot readings, and I fell for her lies hook, line, and sinker. Finally, though, I found an idea as to how to occupy her time making money instead of spending it. I decided we should open a business. Esoterica Curiosities. Since I supplied all the capital, you'd think it would have been in my name. But Angel mailed all the forms without telling me and put the business in her and Jen's name exclusively. You're going to open an occult shop in Bellefonte, as apparently there were none of these in the State College area, but Jen liked the idea of opening an occult shop much more than actually doing it. I think she wanted to collect all the occult stuff more than actually run the business. This business never came to pass, and honestly, are you even surprised at this point? Not long after this, Mila brought them a house so they'd have a new place to stay, and I don't know where that money came from. I think it was actually a mortgaged house. I don't really understand what the difference is between buying a house and having a mortgage on it. I don't know. I'm never going to be able to afford one, so it's a moot point. Let's move forward. Even after this, things still weren't great. Angel was frequently prone to bursts of intense anger, and Jen and Hojo continued to fight as their relationship was at the start of its complete and total deterioration. They also had no respect for the house they were living in, which their friend who they were mistreating allowed them to live in, need I remind you. Mila at one point, in desperation, even wrote on the walls, "My own house," as a protest against the treatment she and the house were getting. She was just so fed up and angry with them. This portion of the story of the Final Fantasy house is the period from where we get pictures of the living conditions they were living in. Up to this point, we'd only heard about this from Icarus. We, as far as I know, don't have any pictures of that very first apartment. But these pictures went viral alongside the story back in the day. They showed rooms cluttered and trashed as Jen and Hojo, and I can only assume Angel as well, had no cares about trashing their living conditions. Honestly, I am not the neatest person in the world. Someone once called my bedroom a dump. I get guilty about that. But even I managed to keep my mess mostly to my room for the most part. I'd never leave public areas in the state these people did. It's disgusting. And once again, much like Icarus before her, Mila was seemingly the only one working full time. She was a stripper, and there is nothing wrong with that. But what is wrong is how much she had to work at it in order to feed the number of mouths she was expected to help provide for. She worked exceptionally hard at this, stripping at 2 to 3 clubs a night, and this wore her down. Some of these strip clubs apparently weren't the safest places for dancers either, so she was putting herself at risk in order to get food on the table and to continue paying bills that nobody else bothered about. And Jen's spending still had not improved. She had to buy new groceries every day, Mila has written, fresh vegetables and fruit, meat, etc. The blood in frozen meat was somehow tainted, and meals always revolved around what Jen wanted to eat. There was no planning ahead. Jen would cook whatever she pleased and started thinking about her meal around 10 p.m. Cooking would begin near midnight and dinner was served in the wee hours. Over the course of them living in this house with Mila, several others ended up moving in as well. More people who Jen lured into her spider web, I suppose. One was named AJ, and another person I've only seen mentioned a few times named Amy or Ami, and on top of that, a third person named Joaquin. This is around the point where I feel like the cult vibes get even stronger than they already were. Before there were one or two people who Jen was trying to subject her beliefs onto at any given time, but now it was quite a few more than that. There were, what is that, like 5 or 6 people living in this house? That's a lot more people than were living in that first apartment, is all I'm saying. Like, it was always a cult, honestly. Everything that she does fits the definition of what cult leaders do, but this is the moment where it goes from kind of fitting the official definition of a cult to absolutely fitting it. Once these others joined, they did work like Mila, but Jen still did not. AJ is one of the main sources of information from this time in Jen's life, and alongside working, he was also pressured by Jen to ask his mother for money, as even with this many people bringing in cash, she still did not manage the household funds at all. She just spent even more. AJ has also provided anecdotes about something I don't think I've mentioned before this point, which is that Jen did not bathe. Ever. Nor did Angel, because the habit ended up rubbing off on her. Instead of bathing, they doused themselves in scented oils and perfumes and claimed that this was healthier. Which is insane, I agree, but I'm pretty sure I've heard of some new age moms claiming this exact same thing nowadays on like TikTok and the like, so unfortunately, this idea seems to have gone a bit more mainstream than it was in 2004. In addition to this, with more people under her control, Jen began using violent means to keep them in check. Angel had quite the temper, and Jen had a habit of winding her up and using her as a strong man to dole out punishment. During a spat with Mila, which occurred around the same time that she wrote on the walls in protest, Angel once punched her in the face after she got into an argument with Jen over a pencil which Mila herself had bought, but which Jen claimed she had instead. So she starts hitting me in the face, and I grab a hold of her hair, and she takes me down onto the floor. Well, I'm laying there under her, and she keeps hitting me in the face, and I'm kicking at anything I can see and biting anything that's in reach. All the while, she's hitting me in the head and the face and pinning me to the ground, and I could feel the berserker under my skin, and I was fighting very hard not to bite chunks out of her, so she hits me just wrong and catches me with her ring on my eye socket, and it starts gushing. A little wound, but there was blood everywhere, and it was kinda deep, so Hojo's like, okay, there's blood, you need to stop, and I go limp, and Angel keeps hitting me for at least the next minute, and I waited until I decided that she really wasn't going to stop, and then I started defending myself again. I tried to keep my hands over my face and head and curl my legs up near my stomach so that she couldn't do much serious damage. So between trying to kick her, I was curled up in the fetal position, and then through Angel's hair, I saw someone coming at me, and so I kicked out, and it was Jen, and she went away. Mila was not the only person who faced this sort of treatment. Others were pushed around, threatened with violence or institutionalization if they had a history of it. And on top of that, food was sometimes also withheld when Jen or Angel thought one of these people had crossed them. In an interview, AJ explained it like this. She was very angry at us for bonding so quickly, the people who had moved in, and spending so much time together. And that's when she started withholding food from us and stuff, which was also, if you know anything about cults, a very common tactic. You withhold sleep and you withhold a little food. They also did withhold sleep, but I didn't notice it as badly as some others would have because I've always had a horrible time sleeping. We also get to hear back from someone else, Marley specifically, who we've not heard from since Jen and Hojo got hitched. Marley had been studying abroad for I think about 2 years at this point and had returned to the States for a visit and had come to their house for Thanksgiving. By the time this Thanksgiving had come around though, Hojo wasn't sharing a bedroom with Jen anymore. Angel had taken his place, and Marley was astounded by how ground down he'd become. Hojo's mom was there and got to witness just how horrible Jen had really become towards him. The food was not properly cooked and was inedible, and Jen was just screaming and crying and blaming everyone but herself, though my understanding was that she wouldn't let anybody help her. I know I had offered and been declined. She was yelling at Hojo, claiming he was physically attacking her. Meanwhile, Hojo's mom was sitting by him and she was clearly horrified. Hojo had become a shell of his former self, and Jen still refused to let him work or have much of a social life. And yet, she was just increasingly ignoring him. As a result, he would just hang out for hours and hours alone in his bedroom. Marley describes how alone and miserable he seemed. But when Marley tried to talk to Hojo about this, he refused to listen. After this point, eventually, a lot of these people who were living in the house finally began to leave, sick of Jen and her bullshit. I believe Joaquin and AJ eventually left. And then finally, after a number of years, I think a year or two, finally, Mila kicked the remaining people out. Specifically, that would have been Jen, Hojo, Angel, and that Ami person who I mentioned. Thanks to Angel still having some connections with people in Arizona, that's where they moved to. And that is where Hojo would eventually finally leave Jen. Mind you, it took him an additional 4 years of living in Arizona with them before he finally left, but eventually he did do it. He's never come forward, so we don't know the details about what led to him leaving. I've heard an anecdote from someone who spoke to someone who knew them during their time in Arizona. Yes, really, this is my source. I know it's not a good one. I know it's like 3 or 4 degrees disconnected from the story, so take it with a grain of salt. But this person speculated that he may have left because this was when he started wanting to medically transition. He wanted to start taking hormones and the like. And Jen didn't want him to, despite the fact that she apparently found his body repulsive. We don't know this for sure, though. In any case, he left, and then, eventually, Angel would leave. While she was the violent enforcer, the relationship between her and Jen was also quite abusive. People can be victims and victimizers at the same time, especially in high-control environments like a cult. I'm not saying this makes any of the things she did to the people around her acceptable. I think lashing out violently like that is pretty fucking horrible, but she was still being abused as well, and it's worth acknowledging that. These things are complicated. I don't think this changes the fact that she did Jen's violent dirty work for like 7 years, as I've said, but I digress. Oh, and also, don't go and harass her over this. This all happened years ago. This is not between you and her, it is between her and the people who she may have harmed whilst dating Jen. It has nothing to do with you. Don't go harass this woman. Jen would go dormant for a number of years after this, and this was essentially the end of the Final Fantasy house, as we knew it, for a number of years at the very least, because she would return to fandom one day, arising specifically in the Hannibal fandom. But that is a story for another day. As such, maybe one day I'll talk about it, but maybe I won't. Discussing her time in the Hannibal fandom is difficult because the person who uncovered a lot of what she was up to in it and who tried to expose her is, divisive. Yes, that's the word I'm going to use. I'm going to be diplomatic and just use the word divisive, even though others have called her many other things, because I don't want her to be mad at me. In any case, that is all I've got about Jennifer Cornett for today. I really want to thank the victims who came forward to share their stories, in addition to the people behind the Human Exception podcast and the r/Jennifer Cornett FF House subreddit. They interviewed these guys and curated a lot of this information, and that is why they are my main source. All in addition to the work done by Icarus back in the day. Without them, I would not have had all the details I've been able to share here. Seriously, thank you so much for giving me permission to use you guys as a source. This video would not have been possible without you. One thing that became clear in me reading through all this is how overt and repetitious the pattern of abuse was with Jen. The same things just kept happening every time with basically everyone, both on a romantic level and with the people she lured in to live with her. Romantically speaking, she would just hyper-focus on someone and would latch onto them, would then become codependent and controlling, and then would, while still being attached to them, jump to someone else, eventually breaking it off with that past partner. Rinse and repeat. Said person, whoever she was focused on, would oftentimes not be allowed to work, would be worn down emotionally and mentally, and would eventually be consumed by her narcissistic behavior. Similar things would occur with the roommates who would be brought in as well. She'd take them in, take their money, sometimes take their time and labor as well, and would be paranoid about them speaking to others. She would force them to buy things for her, and all whilst this was happening, she would try to manipulate them using the concepts of soul bonding. Some more than others would fall under her spell, but they would always, it seems, eventually leave. It is wrong to diagnose someone if you are not a mental health professional and you never met them, but a lot of her behavior fits that of a narcissist. I'm not saying that she's a narcissist. This is just an observation, speaking as someone who has some knowledge about mental health and mental illness, but who is not a mental health professional, who is just observing all this stuff from afar. That's my read on this. Take it however you wish. The neediness, the desire to feel special, the constant self-aggrandizing, it all fits into narcissistic patterns. Final Fantasy House was, as far as I'm aware, the first time this sort of story made waves online. It was a number of years after the fact that Icarus would post about his experiences, like I said, but in its wake, other stories of other fandom cults have occasionally come to the attention of the public. And to be perfectly honest, I worry that in today's modern era, they've become more common than you'd think. This is the third time I've spoken about a group like this, and I have to be honest, I'm worried that these micro-cults are propagating out there across the internet. I don't have a lot of personal proof that I can use to back that up, but there have been a lot of talk from a lot of different cult experts about how cult-like language and mentality is being seen in all parts of society nowadays. And I've certainly met myself a handful of people who said that they were victims of micro-cults, which never got the attention of the broader internet. So I worry. As such, I want to give you a basic overview of how to spot a micro-cult. Thankfully, the things which define a micro-cult are basically the same as any other kind of cult. So we've already got an existing model to use as a guideline here. Specifically, the model I want to use is the BITE model developed by Stephen Hassan, a therapist and sociologist who's been helping people get out of cults for literal decades. BITE stands for Behavior, Information, Thought, and Emotion, and refers to the main points of control that an authoritarian group will target in order to keep you under their thumb. If, for example, someone is forcing you to change how you behave under threat of shunning or other punishment, that's a red flag. That is an example of behavior. If someone is policing the information you should receive, also a red flag, an example of information control. If someone is telling you to distrust your own emotions or tells you are inherently evil, that is also a red flag. That is an example of emotions being controlled. And if someone is trying to influence how you think with thought-terminating cliches, look them up, by instilling an us versus them mentality, or by using techniques to alter your mind, such as hypnosis, intense trance-like states, or even things like sleep or food deprivation, that is an example of thought control, and as you can imagine, is also a red flag. This is just a short list of examples of things which fall under the BITE model. I'm going to link to a PDF of this which has more details below. Even if nobody you know has fallen under the spell of a high control group like this, I seriously urge you to read it over. Everyone is susceptible to these. Cult-like mindsets are everywhere, not just in fandom spaces. Economic cults exist like this as well, and there are tons of them. Some people say that MLMs and pyramid schemes count. When it comes to internet micro-cults, especially ones centered on fandom though, there is more specific advice I think I can give. For example, if someone invites you to a Discord group, that may not be a red flag, but when that Discord group is a small one, devoted to just one or two people's ideas or beliefs, well, that is an issue. Even micro-cults tend to have a leader at the top of their small 5 to 15 people pyramid. Other commonalities I've heard of from people who've gotten out of these sorts of groups are things such as blackmail or shaming to wear down a person's self-esteem. Also a very frequent tactic of any cult, period. When it comes to fandom spaces specifically, I'd also personally say that if you are someone who already has an interest in ideas such as fiction-kin, reality shifting, and so on, you're probably more at risk of being a target for this sort of thing, so be careful about who you listen to. Mind you, this applies to anyone exploring any kind of faith system, whether that be fandom-based, alternative, normative, or whatever. The moment someone starts telling you how special you are, or how special they are, be on guard. I'm not an expert on this. This has been kind of rambly, I know. Please do your own research. Educate yourself. There are a lot of good resources out there. And yeah, just be careful. With all that said, thank you so much for watching. I want to apologize for how scatterbrained this video probably came across as. The story is so huge, and I wanted to get it done before I left, so I didn't spend as much time as usual researching it. I think I spent a week writing this script. However, despite that, I hope you enjoyed and found this enlightening and enjoyable. Have you played Final Fantasy VII? Did you like it? Do you think it'd be worth it for me to play it? Because I never have. Should I try the original or the remake? If so, have you had any experiences with cults or cult-like groups? Maybe as a member or as a almost recruit of one? Please comment below if so, or if you've got thoughts or answers in response to any of these questions or anything else which has come up in this video. Also, what kind of stories or topics would you like to see me cover in the future? I'm always looking for suggestions, so if you've got one, please comment it as well. As I've said, I am moving to a new country. I am heading to London, in fact. So this is the last time I'm going to be filming in this apartment, which feels a little weird, I have to say. The next video was partly filmed here already, though, so it's not the last time you'll be seeing this space. That video is going to be big, though, so be patient, and who knows, depending on how scheduling works out, maybe something will come out before it. I don't know. If you are new here and like what you've seen, click on another one of my videos. I've got some good stuff on here I'm sure you'd like. And if you've enjoyed what you've seen, be sure to hit the like button and to subscribe so you can learn when new videos come out. I've got some really exciting stuff coming up. In addition to all this, if you wish to support the channel financially, you can buy me a coffee with the link below. And yeah, that's all I got. Next time, unless something comes up first, I'm going to be talking all about Ben Drowned. And I hope you're excited because I know I am. But until then, this is David M. signing out, I guess, and I'll see you next time.